The Middle East in the spring of 1967 was like a powder keg waiting for a spark. 19 years had passed since the birth of Israel, and the Arab world had never accepted it as a permanent reality. Israel's victories in the 1948 War of Independence and the 1956 Suez Crisis had scarred Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, leaving behind a determination that one day the Jewish state would be destroyed. Skirmishes along the borders became routine. Farmers in northern Israel lived under the shadow of Syrian artillery shelling from the heights above. Palestinian guerrilla raids, backed by Arab states, crossed the borders. Retaliatory strikes by the Israeli Defense Forces escalated tensions even further. It was a cycle of blow and counterblow that made the region feel permanently on the edge of war. Into this already volatile atmosphere came a spark of misinformation. On May 13, 1967, the Soviet Union falsely informed Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser that Israel had massed 11 to 13 brigades on the Syrian border, poised for invasion. It was not true, but it was enough. Nasser, eager to show leadership in the Arab world, ordered Egyptian troops to move into the Sinai Peninsula. Within days, tanks and soldiers poured across the desert. Then came a dramatic escalation. On May 16, Egypt demanded that the United Nations Emergency Force peacekeepers, stationed in Sinai since 1956, withdraw immediately. The UN complied. A fragile buffer that had kept peace for more than a decade was gone overnight. But Nasser was not finished. On May 22, he made a fateful decision. He closed the Straits of Tiran, blockading Israeli shipping from reaching the Red Sea. For Israel, this was not a diplomatic dispute. It was an act of war. The young nation relied on access to the straits for trade and vital oil supplies. To Israeli leaders, this was an existential threat, a tightening noose around their neck. The Arab world rallied. Iraq sent expeditionary forces to Jordan. Saudi Arabia promised military support. Syria mobilized by early June. Over 240,000 Arab soldiers, more than 2,500 tanks, and nearly 1,000 aircraft surrounded Israel. The Jewish state could muster only about 100,000 troops, 800 tanks, and 300 planes. On paper, it looked like David facing 3 Goliaths at once. In Tel Aviv, fear and uncertainty gripped the government. Should Israel strike first? Could the country survive a war on 3 fronts? Some leaders urged restraint, hoping the United States might intervene diplomatically. But ordinary Israelis dug trenches, stockpiled food, and prepared for the worst. Parents whispered to each other about a second Holocaust, this time on Israeli soil. At the same time, Arab radio broadcasts spoke openly of pushing the Jews into the sea. By June 1, Israel formed a national unity government, bringing political rivals together in the face of mortal danger. Then, on June 4, the decision was made. Israel would not wait to be destroyed. It would strike first. What followed would become one of the most remarkably and controversial military campaigns of the modern age. At precisely 7:45 in the morning on June 5, 1967, the skies over Egypt thundered with the roar of jet engines. Nearly 200 Israeli aircraft lifted off in complete secrecy, flying low over the Mediterranean to avoid radar detection. Their mission was audacious: to cripple the Egyptian Air Force in a single, decisive blow before it could even take off. The operation was codenamed Operation Focus. The Egyptians were unprepared. Their air defense network, ironically, was switched off that morning to avoid friendly fire accidents as senior officers traveled between bases. The timing was perfect. Israeli jets screamed over 14 Egyptian airfields, dropping precision bombs and unleashing cannon fire across runways lined with planes. Within 3 hours, 338 Egyptian aircraft lay in smoking ruins, many of them destroyed before their pilots could even climb aboard. More than 100 Egyptian pilots were killed. Israel had pulled off a feat of near-total surprise. To deceive both its enemies and allies, the Israeli press had been reporting that soldiers were on leave, that life was normal, and that pilots were conducting routine training flights. Even the United States Embassy in Tel Aviv had been missed, tracking antenna secretly damaged to prevent American intelligence from detecting the buildup. But Egypt was not the only target. Later that morning, Jordanian and Syrian jets attempted retaliatory strikes against Israeli cities. The counterattack was swift and merciless. Israeli warplanes swept across the skies of Jordan, Syria, and even Iraq, destroying dozens more aircraft. On the ground, by the end of the day, Israel had lost just 19 planes. In contrast, The Arab coalition had lost over 450. Control of the Skiza, decisive factor in modern warfare, now belonged entirely to Israel. The psychological effect was enormous. Egyptian commanders were stunned, unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster. In Jordan, King Hussein received false reports from Cairo that Egypt was winning the war. Believing the tide was in Arab favor, he committed his army fully, unaware that Israel had already ensured air supremacy. For Israel, Operation Focus was not only a tactical victory, was survival itself. Without air dominance, the small country could never have withstood the overwhelming numerical advantage of its neighbors. With their skies secured, Israeli ground forces now turned to the deserts of Sinai, the hills of Jerusalem, and the cliffs of the Golan Heights. The war that would change the map of the Middle East had truly begun. With the Arab air forces crippled, the battle shifted to the vast, unforgiving deserts of the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt had committed its strongest formations there. 7 divisions with nearly 100,000 men, and close to 950 tanks stretched across the sand, bolstered by infantry, artillery, and fortifications. On paper, this was an imposing wall of steel and firepower. Yet the Egyptian high command was unprepared for the speed and ruthlessness of the Israeli attack. At 7:50 a.m. on June 5, Israeli armor surged forward. Major General Israel Tal's division, a spearhead of tanks and mechanized infantry, advanced through the northern route toward Gaza and Orish. Egyptian commanders at first dismissed it as a diversion. But within hours, the reality became clear. The Israeli 60th Armored Brigade smashed through resistance near Khan Yunis. Paratroopers stormed Raif, and by evening, the road to Arish was pried open, even in the city itself. Egyptian resistance proved desperate. Fighting erupted from balconies and windows, but Israeli reinforcements eventually secured the town. Further south, Major General Ariel Sharon's 38th Armored Division faced a daunting challenge at Abu-Ageila, defended by the Egyptian 2nd Infantry Division with entrenched artillery and minefields. This fortress was key to the entire Sinai front. Sharon devised a daring plan. While armor advanced head-on, Israeli paratroopers landed behind Egyptian lines under cover of night, sowing confusion and knocking out artillery batteries. At dawn, Israeli tanks charged into the defensive positions. The battle was brutal. Fortifications were taken bunker by bunker. Tanks clashed at close range. But by June 6, Abu-Ageila had fallen. 40 Egyptian tanks were destroyed at the cost of 19 Israeli. What followed was not an orderly retreat but a collapse. Egypt's Field Marshal, Abdel Hakim Amr, panicked upon hearing of Abu-Ageila's fall. Convinced the entire front was lost, he ordered a full withdrawal from Sinai without proper coordination, without sequence, without strategy. Thousands of troops abandoned their posts. Vehicles jammed desert roads in chaotic flight. Israeli jets circled overhead, striking columns of men and armor with bombs and napalm. In the narrow passes leading back to Egypt proper, retreating soldiers became targets trapped in killing zones. Some 10,000 Egyptians died in a single day. Still, there were pockets of resistance. In Ben Gafkafa, Egyptian soldiers fought stubbornly before being overwhelmed. But each stand was isolated, cut off by Israeli maneuvers and air supremacy. By June 8, the Sinai Peninsula was lost. The last Egyptian strongholds, Sharm el-Sheikh and Ras Suda fell. After heavy bombardment, in just 3 days, Egypt's army, the pride of the Arab world, had been shattered out for Israel. The strategic gains were immense. The Straits of Tiran were reopened. The entire Sinai Peninsula, stretching hundreds of miles to the Suez Canal, was now in their hands. Yet while Sinai burned, another front exploded to life. One that carried not just strategic but spiritual weight. The ancient city of Jerusalem. Even as Egypt reeled, Israel faced another test. To the east, Jordan commanded the high ridges of the West Bank and controlled East Jerusalem, including the Old City. Initially, Israel had no desire to fight Jordanite, wanted to avoid a two-front war. On June 5, Israeli leaders sent a plea. Through the UN, remain neutral and we will not attack. But King Hussein, persuaded by Nasser's false reports of Egyptian victories, made a fateful choice. Jordan entered the war. That morning, Jordanian artillery unleashed a barrage on West Jerusalem. Explosions tore through neighborhoods, damaging over 900 buildings, killing soldiers and civilians alike. Iraqi jets joined in, bombing Israeli positions. The Israeli response was immediate. Operation Focus extended eastward, destroying Jordan's small air force within hours. The skies were once again Israeli. On the ground, Jordanian forces entrenched themselves in strongpoints across East Jerusalem. At the United Nations headquarters, known as the Government House, they turned the compound into a fortress, firing into Israeli sectors. The Jerusalem Brigade's 161st Battalion stormed the building under heavy fire. Losses were severe, but the Israelis forced the Jordanians back toward Bethlehem. By evening, Israeli brigades had encircled East Jerusalem. The battle for Ammunition Hill, however, would become legendary. Jordanian soldiers fought with grim determination, using trenches and bunkers dug deep into the hillside. Israeli paratroopers attacked in waves. Every officer in the assault fell, except for 2. Hand grenades, bayonets, and close-quarters combat raged for 4 hours before the defenders were overcome. The cost was high, but the path into Jerusalem was open. On June 7, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan issued an order that carried immense weight. Israeli troops were to enter the Old City itself. For nearly 2 millennia, Jews had been barred from their holiest site, the Western Wall, under foreign rule. Now, for the first time since antiquity, the city lay within reach. At dawn, paratroopers of the 55th Brigade pushed through the Lion's Gate. Fearing the destruction of sacred sites, tanks and heavy artillery were held back. Jordanian resistance inside the Old City was light. Within hours, Israeli soldiers reached the Western Wall. Many wept openly. The sound of shofars echoed against ancient stones as soldiers placed their hands on the wall, overwhelmed by the weight of history. Beyond Jerusalem, Israeli forces pressed across the West Bank. Hebron, Bethlehem, Nablus and Ramallah all fell. By the end of June 7, Jordanian troops were in full retreat eastward, crossing the Jordan River. For the first time since 1948, Israel held all of Jerusalem, along with the entire West Bank. The spiritual and political impact was seismic. Israel had not only survived, but reclaimed its most sacred city. Yet one final front remained. Perched high in the north, the formidable Golan Heights. While Israel celebrated victories in Sinai and Jerusalem, the north of the country remained under threat. For years, Syrian artillery stationed atop the Golan Heights had rained shells down on Israeli villages in the valley below. The heights, with their steep slopes and fortified bunkers, were considered nearly impregnable. Attacking them would be a literal uphill battle. Israeli leaders hesitated. Was it worth the blood? But by June 9, new intelligence suggested that Syrian defenses were weaker than believed. With Egypt defeated and Jordan retreating, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan made a bold decision without waiting for full government approval. The Golan would be attacked. Israeli jets struck first, pounding Syrian strongholds, communications, and morale. Then armored brigades began their ascent. Colonel Albert Mandler's 8th Armored Brigade fought its way into the southern sector, capturing Zora Kala and Ein Fit in bloody clashes. The terrain was treacherous, narrow roads, steep cliffs, minefields, but Israeli tanks, supported by relentless air cover, forced their way forward in the central sector. The 181st Battalion stormed Syrian fortresses at Dadara and Tel Hila. Fighting was hand-to-hand, with heavy losses on both sides. By evening, Israeli troops had reached the plateau. Reinforcements poured in overnight. By dawn on June 10, 8 Israeli brigades massed on the high ground, ready to smash through the second line of defenses. The final Syrian resistance collapsed under the combined weight of armor and aviation. By the time an unbrokered ceasefire took effect on June 11, Israel had captured the entire Golan Heights. The 6-day whirlwind was over. The scale of the victory was staggering. In less than a week, Israel had tripled its territory, seizing the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Nearly 1 million Arabs now lived under Israeli control. But the human cost was immense. Almost 1,000 Israelis killed, alongside 15,000 Egyptians, 700 Jordanians, and 2,500 Syrians. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. Israel had proven its military dominance, but its occupation of Arab lands planted the seeds of future conflict. The Arab world, humiliated, would not accept defeat. Just 6 years later, Egypt and Syria would strike again in the Yom Kippur War. Yet, in June 1967, the world watched in awe. A small nation, surrounded by enemies and outnumbered in every category, had won one of the most decisive victories in modern military history. The 6-day war did not end the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it reshaped the map, the politics, and the very identity of the Middle East. And so, when we look back at those 6 days, we see not only a story of tanks and planes, but of destiny, survival, and a struggle that remains unresolved to this day.